Sometimes the people we barely knew in life leave us exactly what we need. Lewis Hensley was 59, divorced, and hadn't spoken to his daughter in months when he got the letter about his uncle's death. Uncle Bernard had lived alone in a mountain lodge for 40 years, and now it belonged to Lewis. He drove north through the snow just to see what he'd inherited. The lodge was quiet and cold, buried in winter silence. Under the staircase, Lewis found an old trunk filled with journals, photographs and letters his uncle never sent. As he read by the fireplace, Lewis realized his uncle had kept a secret all those years. What was it, and why did Lewis feel like he was supposed to find it? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter from the attorney had arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-February, sandwiched between a credit card offer and grocery store circular. Lewis had been standing in his kitchen, too large now for just one person, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm while he stared out the window at nothing in particular. The envelope was cream-colored, formal, with a return address from a law firm in Jackson, Wyoming. He'd opened it with the vague curiosity of a man who'd stopped expecting anything interesting to happen to him. Bernard Kirkland, his mother's brother, had died. The Uncle Lewis could count on one hand the number of times he'd actually seen. The uncle who'd shown up to maybe 3 family gatherings in Lewis's entire childhood, always quiet, always leaving early, always alone. The uncle who'd sent a card when Lewis graduated high school, no money inside, just a note that said, "Make something good of it," in handwriting that slanted backward like it was retreating from the page. The attorney explained that Bernard had left Lewis his property, a lodge in the mountains outside Jackson, about 15 miles from the nearest town. There were no other heirs, no instructions really. Just a rusted key taped to a second page and an address written in Bernard's own hand. Lewis had sat down at his kitchen table and looked at that key for a long time. His marriage to Sandra had ended 8 months earlier. Final papers signed on a Thursday afternoon in a lawyer's office that smelled like old carpet and air freshener. 26 years dissolved into a division of assets and a settlement that left him in this house with too many empty rooms. Sandra had taken the bedroom set, most of the photos, and the good dishes. He'd kept the couch, the television, and a sense of failure that sat in his chest like a stone. Their daughter, Autumn, had stopped calling after the divorce. She was 32 now, living in Portland, working in marketing or communications, something with social media that Lewis didn't quite understand. She'd been polite but distant at the lawyer's office, hugging her mother, nodding at her father. The last conversation they'd had was about selling the house. She thought he should. He didn't know what he thought anymore. Work had become a place to go. He was a project manager at a civil engineering firm, a job he'd held for 18 years. It was fine. It paid well. He showed up, attended meetings, signed off on reports, went home. Nobody asked him to drinks anymore. He'd declined too many times. So when the letter came, offering him something, anything that wasn't this quiet, shapeless life, he'd made a decision that surprised even himself. He packed a bag, loaded his truck, and drove north. The drive took 2 days. Lewis stopped once in Denver, sleeping in a chain hotel, where the heater rattled, and the man in the next room watched television until 3 in the morning. He'd lain awake, staring at the popcorn ceiling, thinking about Bernard. What little he remembered came back in fragments. Bernard at his parents' house for Thanksgiving when Lewis was maybe 10, a tall man with a beard, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots caked with dried mud. He'd sat in the corner of the living room, drinking coffee, speaking only when spoken to. Lewis's mother had seemed nervous around her brother, asking too many questions in a voice that was too bright. His father had mostly ignored Bernard, focusing on the football game. Another memory, Bernard's hand on Lewis's shoulder at his mother's funeral. Lewis had been 23, home from college. Bernard had said, "She was proud of you," and then left before the reception. Lewis never saw him again. That was it. That was the sum total of Uncle Bernard, a man who appeared at the edges of Lewis's life and then vanished back into whatever wilderness he came from. The road into the mountains grew narrow and white. Snow had fallen heavily the night before, and the plows had only cleared the main highways. Lewis's truck handled it well enough, but the last 5 miles to the lodge were slow going, the GPS losing signal twice, leaving him to navigate by printed directions the attorney had included. When he finally found it, the lodge sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. The building was larger than he'd expected, 2 stories, built from dark timber, with a wide covered porch that wrapped around the front. The roof was steep, designed to shed snow. Behind it, through the trees, Lewis could see the edge of a frozen lake, grey ice stretching toward distant mountains. He parked and sat for a moment, engine running, heater blowing. The silence when he turned off the truck was absolute. Lewis climbed out, his boots crunching in the snow. The air was sharp and clean, so cold it hurt to breathe. He walked toward the lodge slowly, taking it in. The porch steps were buried. The windows were dark. A stone chimney rose from the center of the roof, no smoke coming from it. The key fit the front door, which opened with a groan of hinges that hadn't been used in months, maybe longer. Inside, the air was stale and cold, not much warmer than outside. Lewis found a light switch, flipped it. Nothing. He tried another. The power was off. He'd brought a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a large main room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by furniture covered in sheets. Bookshelves lined another wall, packed with volumes whose titles he couldn't read from where he stood. A staircase rose along the far wall, leading to the second floor. The kitchen was through an archway to the right, a wood-burning stove, a deep farmhouse sink, open shelves stocked with canned goods and mason jars. Everything looked frozen in time, waiting. Lewis set his bag down and went back outside to his truck. He'd brought supplies, a cooler with food, bottled water, a camping stove, extra blankets. The attorney had warned him the utilities might be off. He'd planned to stay only a night, maybe 2, just long enough to see what he'd inherited and decide what to do with it. But as he carried his things inside and began exploring, something shifted. He pulled the sheets off the furniture, revealing a worn leather couch, 2 armchairs, a coffee table scarred with cup rings and scratches. He got the fireplace going with wood from a stack. On the porch, watching as warmth began to creep back into the room, he found oil lamps and candles, got them lit. The lodge came alive in the flickering light, shadows dancing on the walls. Upstairs, he found 4 bedrooms, each simply furnished. Bernard's room was obvious. The bed was made. Clothes still hung in the closet. A pair of reading glasses sat on the nightstand. Lewis didn't linger there. It felt like trespassing. Back downstairs, with the fire crackling and the lamps burning, Lewis sat on the couch and looked around. That's when he saw it, the trunk under the staircase. It was easy to miss, tucked into the shadowed space where the stairs met the wall. Old, leather straps, tarnished brass corners, a simple latch. He opened it carefully, the hinges protesting. Inside were journals, dozens of them. Leather-bound, spiral-bound, composition books with mottled covers. They were stacked neatly, filling the trunk almost completely. Between them were photographs, loose and in envelopes. Letters, still sealed, a few objects wrapped in cloth. Lewis lifted out the top journal. The cover was dark brown leather, soft, with age. He opened it to the first page. Bernard's handwriting filled the lines neat, careful, slanting backward. June 1967. I bought the land today. 40 acres, lodge included, for less than it's worth because nobody wants to be this far from everything. That's exactly why I want it. Lewis sat back, the journal in his hands, and began to read. Outside, snow started to fall again. The fire popped and settled. The lodge held him in its silence, and for the first time in months, Lewis didn't feel like he was waiting for his life to start again. He felt like maybe it just had. Lewis read through the night, feeding the fire whenever it burned low, moving one of the oil lamps closer when his eyes grew tired. Bernard's voice came through the pages with a clarity that startled him, direct, thoughtful, more articulate than Lewis had imagined, from a man who'd spent 40 years in the mountains. The early journals documented the work of building a life from scratch. Bernard had been 28 when he bought the property, fresh out of the army after serving in Korea. The war had left marks on him that he didn't write about directly, but Lewis could read between the lines. The need for silence, the difficulty sleeping, the way he described the mountains as quiet enough to think again. He'd spent the first years alone, repairing the lodge that had come with the land, learning to live with the seasons, figuring out what it meant to be self-sufficient. The entries were sparse at first, mostly practical observations about weather and repairs and the wildlife he encountered. But gradually they became more reflective. Bernard wrote about the peace he'd found, about how the work of survival left less room for the things that haunted him. Lewis had fallen asleep on the couch sometime after 3 in the morning, the journal open on his chest. He woke to grey daylight filtering through the windows and the fire reduced to embers. His back ached. The cold had crept back into the room. He rebuilt the fire, made instant coffee with water heated on his camping stove, and returned to reading. It was in the 1972 journal that everything changed. The entry was dated April 14th. A woman showed up today. Just appeared on the porch like she'd been walking through these mountains all her life, though her shoes said otherwise. City clothes, thin coat, no supplies. She asked if I had work. Said she could cook, clean, didn't need much. Her hands were shaking. I asked her name. She said Constance. I asked where she'd come from. She said it didn't matter. I told her I didn't have money to pay anyone. She said she didn't want money, just a place to stay for a while. Something in her voice made me say, yes. Lewis turned the page, kept reading. Constance has been here 2 weeks. She doesn't talk much, but she's made herself useful. Fixed the latch on the kitchen door I'd been meaning to get to for months. Cooked actual meals instead of the canned beans I've been living on. She sleeps in the smallest bedroom upstairs, keeps the door closed. I don't ask questions. Whatever she's running from isn't my business unless she wants it to be. The entries continued through that spring and summer. Slowly, Constance's story emerged. She'd left a husband who'd put her in the hospital twice, no family willing to help, no money of her own. She'd gotten on a bus with one bag and ridden as far as her cash would take her, which happened to be Jackson. From there, she'd heard about the lodge from someone at a diner, a place where a man lived alone and might need help. Bernard had given her refuge. No conditions, no judgment, just space to breathe. In July of that year, someone else arrived. Fritz was 24, hitchhiking west, running from nothing in particular and toward nothing in particular. He'd been camping near the property when he ran out of food. Bernard had found him trying to catch fish from the lake with a bent paperclip. They'd talked. Bernard had offered him dinner. Fritz had stayed. Then in September, Albert showed up. He was 63, a widower who'd lost his farm to the bank. His children had moved to cities, busy with their own lives, no room for a grieving father. He'd heard about Bernard's place from Fritz's sister, who'd received a letter saying her brother had found work at a mountain lodge. Albert had nowhere else to go. Lewis set down the journal and looked around the room with new eyes. 3 strangers had found their way here within 6 months. Bernard had taken them all in. He reached back into the trunk and pulled out a photograph he'd noticed earlier. 4 people standing on the lodge's porch, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. The lodge behind them looked brighter, more alive than it did now. Someone had planted flowers in boxes along the porch railing. Lewis studied each face. Bernard was unmistakable younger, the beard fuller, but the same quiet intensity in his eyes. The woman beside him must be Constance, 50s, dark hair pulled back, laugh lines around her eyes. The young man was clearly Fritz, lanky, grinning, hands shoved in his pockets. And Albert stood at the end, smaller than the others, white-haired, wearing suspenders over a work shirt. They looked like a family. Louis had never known any of this. His mother had never mentioned it. Bernard's rare appearances at family gatherings had never included anyone else. He'd come alone, stayed briefly, left alone. But here, in this place, he'd built something else entirely. Louis picked up his phone to call Autumn. The impulse surprised him. They hadn't spoken in over a month, and their last conversation had ended with her saying she needed space. But something about the photograph, about discovering this hidden piece of family history, made him want to share it with her. The signal was weak, but present. The phone rang 4 times before she answered. "Dad? Hey, I know I wasn't supposed to call, but is something wrong?" Her voice was cautious, the warmth he remembered from when she was younger buried under layers of learned distance. "No, nothing's wrong. I'm in Wyoming. I inherited Uncle Bernard's property, and I'm up here looking at it." Silence. Then, "Uncle Bernard died? Last month. You didn't know him well, I know. I barely knew him. But Autumn, I found something here. Journals. Photographs. He lived here for 40 years. And he wasn't alone. He had people with him, people he helped. It's like he created this. Whole. Dad." She cut him off. "I'm at work. Can this wait? I just thought you'd want to know. It's family history." "Family history," she said it flatly. "From a man who showed up to maybe 3 family events my entire life, who nobody really knew. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I'm learning who he was. I think you'd find it interesting. What I'd find interesting is if you'd stop playing hermit up there and deal with the real world. You have a house to sell. You have paperwork to file. This, whatever this is, it's just another way to avoid dealing with your life." The words stung because they were partially true. He had been avoiding things. The empty house, the job he didn't care about. The divorce papers still sitting unsigned on his kitchen counter because Sandra wanted to refinance and needed his signature. "I'm not avoiding anything," he said. "I'm trying to understand something." "Understand what? That some old guy lived in the woods?" "That's not profound, Dad. That's just—" She sighed. "Look, I have a meeting in 5 minutes. Do whatever you need to do with the property, but please don't turn this into some kind of vision quest. Just sell it and move on." "Autumn, I have to go." The line went dead. Louis sat holding the phone, the photograph still in his other hand. Outside, the snow had started again, thick flakes falling past the windows. The lodge felt very quiet, suddenly, very far from everything. He looked at Bernard's face in the photograph, at the people standing beside him. A chosen family. People who'd needed help and found it here. His daughter's words echoed, "Just sell it and move on." But as Louis looked around the lodge at the journals still waiting to be read, at the life his uncle had built here, he realized he didn't want to move on. Not yet. He wanted to understand what Bernard had created and why it felt like it might have something to do with him. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling the windows. Louis added more wood to the fire and reached for the next journal. He wasn't going anywhere. The storm kept Louis at the lodge for 3 days. Not that he minded. The roads became impassable, snow piling up in drifts that reached halfway up the porch railing. He settled into a rhythm, wake with the grey dawn light, rebuild the fire, heat water for coffee, read. The journals from 1973 through 1975 painted a picture of daily life that was both simpler and richer than anything Louis had known. Bernard wrote about the routines they'd established, Constance cooking breakfast while Fritz split wood and Albert tended a garden he'd started behind the lodge. They worked together on repairs, on projects to make the lodge more livable. They played cards in the evenings. They read books aloud by the fire. Bernard's entries became less about himself and more about observing the others. He wrote about watching Constance slowly relax, her shoulders dropping from around her ears, her laugh coming more easily. About Fritz learning to build things with his hands, discovering he had a talent for it. About Albert teaching them all to read the forest, to identify plants and trees, to understand the mountain's moods. Constance made stew tonight, Bernard had written in November 1973. Real stew, with vegetables from Albert's garden and venison Fritz brought in. We sat around the table for 2 hours after we'd finished eating, just talking. Albert told stories about his farm. Fritz talked about his sister's kids. Constance shared a recipe her grandmother used to make. I realized I haven't felt lonely in months. I'd forgotten what it was like to not feel lonely. Louis set the journal down and looked toward the kitchen. Through the archway, he could see the old wood-burning stove, the deep sink, the open shelves. He'd been eating from cans and packages, heating water on his camping stove. The kitchen felt dormant, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. On his second day, trapped by the storm, Louis found a wooden recipe box tucked on a shelf above the sink. The wood was worn smooth, the hinges loose. Inside were dozens of index cards, each one covered in neat handwriting. Constance's handwriting. He recognized it from a letter he'd found in the trunk, one she'd written to Bernard years after she'd left. He pulled out cards at random. Beef stew, cornbread, apple pie, roasted chicken with herbs. Each recipe had notes in the margins. Fritz likes extra pepper. Albert can't eat onions. Double this for winter. Louis studied a recipe for something called lodge breakfast. Eggs, potatoes, whatever vegetables were available, all cooked together in one pan. The note at the bottom read, Sunday tradition, everyone helps cook. He looked at the ingredients. He had eggs in his cooler, potatoes, an onion, some cheese that was still good. The wood stove took some figuring out. He had to clear out old ash, get a fire going in the firebox, wait for it to heat up. But once he had it going, the warmth spread through the kitchen in a way his camping stove never managed. He found cast iron pans hanging from hooks, cleaned one, got it heating. Cooking on the wood stove required attention. The temperature was hard to control. But Louis found himself enjoying the challenge. The way he had to stay present, couldn't just set a timer and walk away. He chopped the potatoes, diced the onion, cracked the eggs into a bowl the way Constance's recipe instructed. The smell filled the kitchen, onions caramelizing, potatoes browning, eggs cooking through. His stomach growled. He hadn't realized how hungry he was for real food, something made with his hands instead of opened from a can. When it was done, he scooped it onto a plate and sat at the kitchen table. The table was solid oak, scarred with decades of use. He could imagine Bernard and the others sitting here, passing dishes, talking about their day. The food was simple but satisfying. As he ate, Louis thought about the last time he'd cooked a real meal. Before the divorce, probably, Sandra had done most of the cooking. He'd been good at grilling, decent at breakfast, but the daily work of feeding a family had been hers. After she left, he'd survived on takeout and frozen dinners. Autumn had loved cooking when she was younger. He remembered her in their kitchen at age 10, standing on a stool so she could reach the counter, helping Sandra make cookies. She'd been so focused, so serious about getting the measurements right. When had that stopped? When had they stopped doing things together? He washed his plate in cold water from a jug he'd filled from melted snow, then returned to the main room and the journals. The 1,974 entries introduced him to Fritz's transformation. The young man had arrived aimless, running from a childhood that Bernard only hinted at in his writing. But Albert had taken him under his wing, teaching him woodworking. They'd set up a workshop in a shed behind the lodge. Fritz made his first real piece today, Bernard wrote in June 1974. A side table. Simple design, but the joinery is solid. Albert checked every joint, and Fritz had done them all correctly. The kid beamed. I haven't seen him smile like that since he got here. Albert told him he had a gift for it. Fritz said nobody had ever told him he had a gift for anything. Later, I found him in the workshop, just running his hands over the wood, like he couldn't believe he'd made something that would last. Louis found himself getting up, pulling on his coat, and heading outside despite the snow. The cold hit him like a wall, but he pushed through it, following a path that had been partly cleared by wind. Behind the lodge, he found the workshop a small building with a slanted roof, door hanging slightly open. Inside, it was dim but dry. A workbench ran along one wall, tools hanging above it. A table saw sat in one corner, covered with a tarp, and everywhere on shelves, on the floor, stacked. Against walls were pieces of furniture in various states of completion. Louis moved through the space slowly, examining each piece. A rocking chair with curved runners, a bookshelf with dovetailed joints, a chess table with an inlaid board. All of them showed the same careful craftsmanship, the same attention to detail. He found a box pushed under the workbench. Inside were letters, all addressed to Bernard, all from the same person, Fritz Kowalski. Louis sat on the workshop floor and read through them. The letters spanned decades. Fritz had left the lodge in 1979, Bernard's journals had mentioned, but the two had stayed in touch. Fritz had moved to Montana, started his own furniture business. The early letters were tentative, grateful. The later ones were confident, successful. Fritz sent photos of his workshop, of pieces he'd made, of his wife and later his children. One letter, dated 1995, included a newspaper clipping. Local craftsman's work featured in National magazine. The photo showed Fritz, older now but still recognizable, standing in a workshop surrounded by beautiful furniture. "I owe it all to you and Albert," Fritz had written. "You gave me time to figure out who I could be. You showed me I was worth something. I tell my kids about the lodge all the time, about the family we built there. I hope someday I can give someone what you gave me." Louis sat in the cold workshop, holding the letter, understanding something he hadn't quite grasped before. Bernard hadn't just provided shelter. He'd provided time for broken people to heal, to discover themselves, to become who they were meant to be. When had Louis last had time like that? Time that wasn't scheduled, wasn't productive, wasn't moving him toward some goal. Time to just exist and figure things out. He couldn't remember. Back inside the lodge, Louis found himself looking at the space differently. The loose step on the staircase he'd noticed, the window in the kitchen that didn't quite close right, the door to the pantry that stuck. He spent the rest of the afternoon making repairs. He found tools in the workshop, materials in a storage closet. The work was simple but satisfying, tightening screws, planing wood, adjusting hinges. His hands remembered skills he'd forgotten he had. His father had taught him basic carpentry when he was young, before college and career had pulled him away from that kind of work. As the light faded, Louis stood back and looked at what he'd accomplished. Small things. But the lodge felt more solid somehow, more cared for. That night, by the fire, he read more of Bernard's journals. An entry from December 1975 stopped him. "Albert said something today that I've been thinking about all evening. We were working on the roof, replacing some shingles before the heavy snow comes, and he said, 'You know what I've learned living here? People need to be needed. That's the secret. Not just having a place to stay, but having something to contribute, something that matters.' He's right. Everyone here has a role. Constance keeps us fed. Fritz keeps things built and fixed. Albert keeps us connected to the land. And me, I guess I keep the door open. I make sure there's room for people who need it." Louis closed the journal and stared into the fire. People need to be needed. He thought about his job, where he'd become interchangeable, just another project manager in a sea of them. He thought about his marriage, where toward the end he'd felt more like a roommate than a partner. He thought about Autumn, who'd built a life that didn't seem to have space for him in it. Where was he needed? The question sat with him as the fire burned low and the lodge settled into nighttime silence. Outside, the storm finally began to ease. By the fourth morning, the storm had passed. Lewis woke to brilliant sunshine reflecting off fresh snow. The world outside transformed into something almost painfully bright. He made coffee, ate the last of his supplies, and knew he needed to make a decision. The roads would be clearing. He could leave, drive back to his empty house and his empty life, put the lodge up for sale like Autumn had suggested. Or he could stay a little longer. He chose to stay. The nearest town was Ridgewood, population maybe 800, 15 miles down the mountain. Lewis drove in slowly, his truck handling the icy roads better than he'd expected. The town consisted of one main street, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station, a small grocery store, a post office. Mountains rose on all sides, making the place feel like it existed in a pocket of the world that time had passed by. He stopped at the hardware store first. The bell over the door jangled as he entered. An older man behind the counter looked up from a newspaper, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. "Help you find something?" "I need supplies," Lewis said. "I'm staying at the Kirkland place up the mountain." The man's expression shifted, something like recognition crossing his face. "Bernard's lodge?" "That's right. I'm his nephew, Lewis Hensley." The man came around the counter, extending his hand. "George Patterson. I heard Bernard passed. I'm sorry for your loss." They shook hands. George's grip was firm, his hands calloused from years of work. "I didn't know him well," Lewis admitted. "I'm trying to understand who he was." "He was a good man," George said simply. "Quiet, kept to himself mostly. But good. He helped my wife and me once, back in '09. Business was struggling. We were about to lose this place. Bernard came in one day, bought enough supplies to keep us afloat for months, told me to put it on account, that he'd pay it off slowly. Never missed a payment." Lewis felt a flicker of that same realization he'd had, reading the journals. Bernard's generosity had extended beyond the lodge. He bought what he needed: oil for the lamps, batteries, basic food supplies, repair materials. George helped him load everything into the truck, then stood on the sidewalk as Lewis prepared to leave. "You planning to stay up there?" "For a while," Lewis said. "I'm still figuring things out." George nodded. "If you need anything, you know where to find us. And, Hensley, whatever you decide to do with the place, I hope you'll think about what Bernard built there. It meant something." Lewis drove back to the lodge thinking about those words. It meant something. But what, exactly? And to whom? Over the next week, Lewis fell into a routine. He woke with the sun, made breakfast on the wood stove, spent mornings reading journals, and afternoons working on the lodge. He replaced broken window panes, patched holes in the porch roof, cleaned out gutters that had filled with years of pine needles and debris. The physical work felt good, necessary. He was sore in the evenings, but it was the kind of soreness that came from use, not neglect. The journals continued to reveal Bernard's world. He read about Albert's garden, about how the older man had taught them all to identify edible plants, to read weather patterns, to move through the forest without disturbing it. Albert had been a farmer his whole life, and he'd brought that knowledge to the mountains, adapting what he knew to this different landscape. One afternoon, Lewis found a portfolio in Bernard's bedroom closet. Inside were drawings, detailed botanical illustrations of plants, flowers, trees. Each one was labeled in careful handwriting: common name, Latin name, uses. The drawings were beautiful, precise work that showed deep observation and skill. Albert's work. It had to be. Lewis studied each drawing, recognizing some of the plants from his walks around the property: wild roses, mountain sage, lodgepole pine. Each illustration included notes about the plant's properties. Berries attract birds in fall, bark can be used for tea, roots help prevent erosion. At the back of the portfolio, he found a letter dated 1984, written in Bernard's hand but addressed to no one. Albert died this morning, peaceful, in his sleep, which is what he wanted. He was 81. We buried him up on the ridge overlooking the lake, where he used to go to watch the sunrise. Constance and Fritz helped me dig. The ground was hard, but we managed. He'd picked the spot himself. Last summer, when he knew he was getting weaker, said he wanted to stay here, part of the mountain. We put his drawings in a box beside him. His real legacy, though, is what he taught us. How to see the forest as something alive and connected. How to be still enough to belong to a place. I'll miss him every day. Louis set the letter down and looked out the window toward the ridge Bernard had mentioned. He could see it from here, a high point with a clear view of the frozen lake below, mountains stretching endlessly beyond. That afternoon, he hiked up to the ridge. The snow was deep, and he had to stop frequently to catch his breath. But eventually, he reached the top. No headstone marked the spot, but he found it anyway, a slight depression in the snow, a sense of intentionality to the place. Someone had arranged rocks in a circle here, now mostly covered. Louis stood there for a long time, looking at the view Albert had loved. The mountains were vast and indifferent, but there was beauty in that indifference. A reminder that some things were bigger than human worry, human failure. He thought about Albert losing everything, wife, farm, purpose, and finding new purpose here. Growing a garden in rocky soil, teaching others what he knew, choosing where to rest when his work was done. When Louis returned to the lodge, his phone showed 3 missed calls from Autumn. He called her back, uncertain what to expect. "Dad." She sounded tired. "Where have you been?" "At the lodge. The signal isn't great up here. I've been trying to reach you for 2 days. I thought," she paused, "I thought something might have happened. I'm fine. The storm passed. I've just been working on the place." Another pause. "Working on it?" "Repairs. It needs a lot of work. I've been reading Uncle Bernard's journals, learning about the people who lived here." "Autumn. There's so much I didn't know. He created this whole community, helped people who had nowhere else to go. That's," her voice caught, "that's actually kind of amazing." The shift in her tone surprised him. "You think so?" "Yeah. I mean, it's not what I expected. When you first called, I thought you were just hiding out. But if he was actually doing something meaningful there, that's different." They talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation they'd had in months. Autumn told him about work stress, about a relationship that had ended badly, about feeling lost in ways she hadn't wanted to admit. Louis listened, really listened, not trying to fix anything or offer advice, just being present. Before they hung up, she said, "Maybe I could visit sometime. See the place." "Like that," Louis said, and meant it. That night, he found Fritz's chess set in Bernard's bedroom. It sat on a small table by the window, the pieces still arranged mid-game. Louis picked up one of the pieces, a knight, carved with incredible detail. You could see the horse's mane, the subtle musculature, the determined expression. Fritz had made this during his years at the lodge, creating beauty from wood while he learned who he could be. Louis carried the chess set downstairs and set it up on the coffee table. He didn't know who Bernard had been playing against. Maybe himself, maybe a memory, but the game felt unfinished. He studied the board, trying to understand the strategy, what move should come next. In the journal from 1976, he found an entry about Fritz leaving. "Fritz packed his truck today. He's heading to Montana, going to apprentice with a furniture maker he met at a craft fair. I'm happy for him and sad for myself. The lodge will be quieter without him, but this is how it's supposed to work. People come here broken, and if we do our job right, they leave whole. They leave ready to build their own lives. That's the point. Not to keep them, but to give them what they need to go." Fritz hugged me before he left, said he'd never forget what this place gave him, said he'd never forget that someone believed he was worth saving. I told him he saved himself. We just gave him time and space to do it. Louis closed the journal and looked around the lodge. In the firelight, with the oil lamps burning, the space felt alive. Not empty, despite him being the only person here. The ghosts of Bernard's family lingered in the worn furniture, the books on the shelves, the chess set, waiting for its next move. He realized something then, sitting in the quiet. He didn't want to sell this place. He wanted to understand it, maybe even continue what Bernard had started. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it felt like the first clear purpose he'd had in years. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled and settled. Louis reached for another journal, ready to keep reading, to keep learning what his uncle had built and why it mattered. He was beginning to understand that he hadn't inherited a burden. He'd inherited a second chance. The journals from the early 1980 seconds showed Bernard at his most reflective. Constance had left in 1986, healed enough to reconnect with the children she'd left behind. But the years before her departure revealed a deepening philosophy about what the lodge represented. Louis found himself drawn to these entries, reading them slowly, sometimes rereading passages that struck him. One entry from March 1982 stayed with him. Constance asked me today why I do this. Why I let strangers stay here, why I don't charge rent, why I give so freely when I could live more comfortably alone. I told her the truth, because I needed it once too. After Korea, I was lost. Angry. Couldn't sleep, couldn't hold a job, couldn't stand being around people. I came here to disappear. But disappearing isn't the same as healing. Healing requires connection, even when connection is the last thing you think you want. These mountains gave me space to breathe. I want to give that to others. Louis set down the journal and looked out at the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the snow orange and pink. He understood what Bernard meant about space to breathe. The lodge had given him that distance from the divorce, from autumn's disappointment, from the shapeless drift of his days. But Bernard hadn't just taken space. He'd built something with it. In Bernard's study, Louis found a wooden portfolio he hadn't noticed before. Inside were more drawings, but different from Albert's botanical illustrations. These were architectural sketches, landscape plans, drawings of the property from different angles. Some included notes, garden expansion, workshop addition, trail markers to lake. Albert's drawings were here too, organized and protected. Dozens of them, each more detailed than the last. Louis pulled them out carefully, spreading them across the desk. Wildflowers, pine cones, a detailed cross-section of tree bark, a study of a bird's nest. At the bottom of the portfolio was a letter, the paper yellowed with age. Dear Bernard, I'm writing this because I want you to understand what you've given me. When I arrived at your door, I had nothing. Margaret was gone. The farm was gone. My children were scattered across the country, busy with lives that had no room for a grieving old man. I came here thinking I'd wait to die. Instead, I learned to live again. These mountains demanded attention. You can't sleepwalk through a place like this. You have to be present, or you'll miss everything that matters. You gave me work to do the garden, the trails, teaching the others about the land. You gave me purpose when I thought my purpose was finished. The drawings I've been making are my way of saying thank you, my way of documenting what I've learned here, so maybe someone else can benefit from it. I won't live forever, but maybe my knowledge can. Thank you for letting an old man feel useful again. Albert. The letter wasn't dated, but Louis guessed it was from shortly before Albert's death. He read it twice, then carefully placed it back in the portfolio. People need to be needed. Albert had understood that. Bernard had understood it. Had given each person who came here something to contribute, some way to feel essential. Louis thought about his last years at work, how he'd become just another cog, easily replaced. How meetings had multiplied while meaningful work had diminished. How he'd started arriving late and leaving early because nobody seemed to notice either way. He decided to go outside, to walk the trails Albert had marked. The afternoon was cold but clear. Louis bundled up and followed a path that led into the forest behind the lodge. Every 50 yards or so, he found marks carved into tree trunks, simple symbols that indicated direction, distance, points of interest. Albert's work, still visible after decades. The trail led him deeper into the woods, where the silence was broken only by wind in the branches and the occasional call of a bird. He found places where Albert had built small cairns, marking viewpoints or resting spots. He found the remains of a lean-to shelter, collapsed now but still showing the careful construction. After an hour of walking, he emerged at a clearing on the ridge. The view was spectacular, the entire valley spread below, the lodge visible as a dark shape among the trees, the frozen lake beyond it catching the late sun. Louis stood there, breathing hard from the climb, feeling his heart pound. The air was so clean it hurt. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this physically present, this aware of his own body moving through space. His phone buzzed. Somehow, he had signal up here. A text from Autumn. "Been thinking about what you said, about Uncle Bernard helping people. I looked him up online. Found an old article about the lodge from 1995. Did you know about it?" Louis texted back, "No. What article?" A minute later, his phone buzzed again with a link. The article was from a Wyoming newspaper, titled "Mountain Man's Quiet Kindness." It featured a photo of Bernard standing on the lodge porch, looking uncomfortable with the attention. Louis read the article, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. A journalist had heard about Bernard from someone in Ridgewood and had driven up to interview him. The article described the lodge as an informal refuge for people going through difficult transitions. It mentioned Constance, Fritz, and Albert by first names only, respecting their privacy. It quoted Bernard saying, "Everyone needs a place to land sometimes. I just try to keep the door open." The article mentioned others who'd stayed at the lodge over the years. A teacher recovering from burnout, a veteran dealing with PTSD, a woman escaping domestic violence, a man who'd lost his family in an accident and needed time away from everything that reminded him of them. The journalist wrote, "Bernard Kirkland doesn't advertise. He doesn't ask for donations. He simply provides space for people who need it, asking nothing in return except that they contribute what they can, cooking, cleaning, repairs, whatever matches their abilities. The lodge operates on trust and mutual respect, proving that sometimes the most radical act is simply caring for strangers." Louis lowered his phone, looking out at the valley. How many people had come through here? How many lives had been changed by what Bernard had built? And why had Bernard kept it so quiet? Why had the family never known? That evening, back at the lodge, Louis called Autumn again. She answered immediately. "Did you read the article?" "I did. I can't believe nobody knew about this. Mom never mentioned anything. I don't think she knew," Louis said. "Bernard kept his life here separate. But why? What he was doing was amazing. Why hide it?" Louis thought about that. Maybe because making it public would have changed it, made it about him instead of about the people he was helping. Some things are meant to be quiet. They talked for an hour. Autumn asked questions about the journals, about the people Louis had read about the lodge itself. Her voice carried a warmth he hadn't heard in years. She sounded genuinely interested, engaged. "Dad, I think I need to come see this place. I've been looking at plane tickets. You don't have to, I want to. I've been feeling stuck lately. Lost. Kind of. Maybe seeing the lodge, understanding what Uncle Bernard built, maybe that would help. Plus, I miss you. I know things have been weird between us, but I miss you." Louis felt something catch in his throat. "I miss you too." After they hung up, he sat by the fire for a long time, thinking about connection. How easily it frayed, how much work it took to maintain, how precious it was when you found it again. He picked up the next journal, ready to keep reading. But first, he added a log to the fire and pulled Constance's unfinished quilt from the cedar chest where he'd found it. The quilt was beautiful, dozens of squares, each one unique, each one representing a person who'd found refuge here. Several squares remained empty, the fabric pinned but not sewn, the needle and thread still waiting. Louis ran his hand over the squares, feeling the different textures. Flannel, denim, cotton worn soft with wear. Each piece had been someone's clothing, someone's story. The quilt wasn't just decoration, it was history. Evidence of lives that had intersected here, of a family chosen rather than born. He thought about his own life. What fabric would represent him? His old work shirts, probably. Boring button-downs in neutral colors. Clothes that said nothing except that he'd shown up, done his job, gone home. But maybe that was changing. Maybe being here was changing it. Outside, night settled over the mountains. Inside, the fire burned steady. Louis returned the quilt to its chest and picked up Bernard's journal again, ready to learn more about the man who'd built all this. Ready to understand what it meant to create something that mattered. The journals from the late 1980 seconds and through the 1990 seconds showed a pattern. People came, stayed weeks or months, then left to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Bernard documented each one briefly, respecting their privacy but recording what they'd taught him, what they'd contributed to the lodge. A woman named Diane, who'd taught everyone to identify bird calls. A man called Preston, who'd rebuilt the entire kitchen plumbing system. A couple, Vera and Sterling, who'd stayed 6 months while grieving their stillborn child, eventually leaving stronger and ready to try again. Each person left something behind: knowledge, improvements, small artifacts. Bernard kept them all, honoring what each person had given. Louis found Constance's quilt again on a quiet afternoon. He'd been avoiding it, unsure why it affected him so deeply. But this time he pulled it out completely, spreading it across the couch to examine every square. Each piece of fabric had been carefully chosen. Bernard's work shirt pocket, the fabric faded blue with white stitching. Fritz's woodworking apron, covered in stains and burns. Albert's gardening gloves, the leather worn soft. Constance's own floral dress, the pattern still visible despite decades of wear. But there were other squares too. A patch from what looked like military fatigues. A piece of bright yellow fabric that might have been a child's dress. A square of plaid flannel. Each one represented someone Louis hadn't read about yet, someone whose story was documented in the journals still waiting. The empty squares were the most striking, 6 of them, fabric pinned but not sewn, waiting to be completed. Beside the quilt was a small basket containing needles, thread in various colors, and a folded piece of paper. Louis unfolded the paper. Instructions, in Constance's handwriting. For whoever continues this work, each square should be about 4 inches, cut from clothing that belonged to the person, something they wore often, something that carries their presence. Sew them in the order people arrived. Leave space between stories. The quilt isn't meant to be finished, it's meant to grow. When you add a square, think about what that person gave to the lodge. Say their name aloud, let the place remember. Louis sat, holding the instructions, understanding what he was looking at. This wasn't just a quilt. It was a living record, meant to continue as long as the lodge served its purpose. Bernard's last journal entry, dated 3 weeks before his death, mentioned the quilt. I've been thinking about the empty squares. Constance left them deliberately, believing someone would continue the work. I won't live to see who that someone is. My health is failing faster than I'd like, but I find comfort in the idea that the lodge will outlive me, that someone will come here, understand what we built, and carry it forward. Maybe it's foolish to believe that. Maybe I'm just an old man hoping his life meant something. But when I look at that quilt, at all those lives that intersected here, I think we did something right. We gave people time. We gave them space to become themselves again. That's worth continuing. Lewis set down the journal, his vision blurred. Bernard had known, had hoped, had left all of this for someone who would understand. But Lewis wasn't sure he was that person. He was just a failed husband, a distant father, a man who'd spent 20 years managing projects that didn't matter. What did he know about healing people? About creating refuge? He walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. The sun was setting again, the daily reminder that time kept moving whether he was ready or not. His phone rang. Autumn. Hey, Dad. I booked a ticket. I'm coming next Friday. That's great. He tried to sound enthusiastic, but something in his voice must have given him away. What's wrong? Nothing. I'm just... He paused, trying to find words. I'm reading about everything Bernard did here, all the people he helped, and I keep thinking, what if I can't do that? What if I'm not capable of continuing what he started? Silence on the other end. Then Autumn said, why would you have to continue it? Because someone should. Because it mattered. Because... He stopped, realizing he hadn't articulated this thought before, even to himself. Because I don't want to go back to how things were. I don't want to go back to that empty house, that job that doesn't need me, that life where nothing I do makes a difference. Dad. Her voice was gentle. You don't have to save the world. You don't have to be Uncle Bernard. You just have to figure out what you need. What if what I need is to do something that matters? Then do it, but do it because it's right for you, not because you think you owe it to a dead man you barely knew. After they hung up, Lewis sat with her words. Was that what this was? Some misplaced obligation? Or was it something else? A genuine calling toward a different kind of life? He spent the next morning exploring the property more thoroughly. Behind the workshop, he found what must have been Albert's garden, now overgrown, but still showing signs of intentional design. Raised beds, a small greenhouse with most of its glass missing, trellises for climbing plants. Lewis could picture it in summer, vegetables growing, herbs spilling over the edges of beds, Albert moving through the rows with his careful attention. The garden had fed everyone at the lodge, had been Albert's contribution, his way of being needed. Lewis knelt and pushed aside snow, finding the soil beneath still, rich and dark. With work, this could grow things again. That afternoon, he drove back to Ridgewood. At the diner, a woman around his age was working the counter. Her name tag read Harriet. "Help you?" she asked. "Coffee, please, and whatever you recommend for lunch." She poured coffee, studying him. "You're staying at the Kirkland place." It wasn't a question. Small towns, Lewis thought. Everyone knows everything. That's right, I'm his nephew. Her expression softened. Bernard was a good man. Used to come in here once a month, always brought whoever was staying with him, always tipped well, even when I knew money was tight. You knew about the people he helped? Everyone knew, sort of. Bernard wasn't secretive about it, just private. There's a difference. He'd bring folks to town when they needed supplies, introduce them just by first names, never explain their situations. We learned not to ask questions. Some people need privacy to heal. She brought him meatloaf and mashed potatoes, comfort food that reminded him of his mother's cooking. "What are you planning to do with the place?" Harriet asked. "I'm not sure yet. Still figuring that out." She nodded. "Well, if you decide to keep it going what Bernard did, this town would support that. We lost something when he died. It'd be good to have it back." Lewis drove back to the lodge thinking about her words. The town would support it, but could he do it? Did he have what Bernard had, the patience, the wisdom, the ability to hold space for broken people? That night, he pulled out Bernard's address book. Dozens of names, addresses, phone numbers. Some entries had notes. Montana, furniture maker. Colorado, teaching again. Oregon, remarried. Lewis picked up his phone and dialed Fritz's number. It rang 4 times before someone answered. "Hello? Is this Fritz Kowalski?" "Yes." "Who's this?" "My name is Lewis Hensley. I'm Bernard Kirkland's nephew. I inherited the lodge." Silence. Then, "Bernard's gone?" "A few months ago. I'm sorry to be the one telling you." Lewis heard a sharp intake of breath, then quiet for several seconds. When Fritz spoke again, his voice was thick. "That place saved my life. Bernard saved my life. How can I help?" They talked for an hour. Fritz shared memories, stories that weren't in the journals. Bernard's dry sense of humor. His way of knowing when someone needed to talk and when they needed silence. How he'd taught Fritz that your past didn't have to define your future. "Are you going to keep the lodge running?" Fritz asked. "I don't know. I want to, but I'm not sure I can do what Bernard did." "Nobody can do what Bernard did, but maybe you can do what Lewis does. Maybe that's enough." After they hung up, Lewis sat with those words. What Lewis does? What would that even be? He looked around the lodge at the furniture he'd uncovered, the repairs he'd made, the fire he'd kept burning for weeks now. He'd been taking care of this place without quite realizing it. Making it home. Maybe that was something. He pulled Constance's quilt onto his lap, running his hands over the squares. Each person had arrived broken and left whole. Each had contributed something. Each had mattered. Could he create that for others? Could he be what Bernard was, a keeper of doors, a holder of space? Lewis didn't have an answer. But for the first time, he thought maybe he didn't need one yet. Maybe he just needed to stay, keep learning, keep the lodge ready. For who or what, he wasn't sure. But he was beginning to believe it was possible. Lewis found the envelope on a Saturday morning, buried under a stack of unopened mail on Bernard's desk. The county seal should have warned him, but he'd grown careless about official documents. Most of them were just formalities, transfer of title papers, utility notices, things the attorney had told him to expect. This one was different. Final notice, tax delinquency, was printed across the top in red letters. Lewis's stomach dropped as he read. The lodge owed 3 years of back property taxes. Bernard had missed payments starting in 2022, the penalties accumulating month by month. The total amount due, including interest and fees, was $48,000. The letter was dated 2 weeks ago. He had until March 15th to pay in full, or the county would begin foreclosure proceedings. That gave him 23 days. Lewis sat down hard, the letter shaking in his hands. $48,000. He didn't have it. Not after the divorce settlement, which had split their savings and left him with enough to live on, but not enough for emergencies. Certainly not enough for this. He searched through more papers, finding earlier notices that Bernard had never opened. The progression was there, gentle reminders becoming stern warnings, becoming this final ultimatum. Bernard's last bank statement showed why he couldn't pay. Medical bills had drained his accounts. Cancer treatment, hospitalizations, medications. Bernard had spent everything trying to buy himself more time. Lewis felt sick. He'd been here for weeks, falling in love with this place, imagining a future, and the whole time it had been slipping away. The county didn't care about Bernard's legacy or the people he'd helped. They cared about taxes owed. He called the county assessor's office. The woman who answered was sympathetic, but clear. "The amount is correct. We've been very patient, Mr. Hensley, but at this point the law requires us to proceed with collection. You can set up a payment plan if you pay at least half up front. $24,000. He still didn't have it. What happens if I can't pay? The property goes to auction. The county recoups the taxes owed, and the remaining amount, if any, goes to you as the owner." Lewis thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. An auction. The lodge sold to the highest bidder, probably some developer who'd tear it down and put up vacation rentals or sell it off in parcels. Everything Bernard had built, everything it represented, gone. He spent the rest of the day in a fog, mechanically going through motions. He called a real estate agent in Jackson, got a rough estimate of the property's value, maybe $300,000, given the location and acreage, enough to clear the debt and walk away with something. Enough to justify cutting his losses. The agent could list it immediately. With luck, they might find a buyer before the auction date, though that was optimistic in winter. Lewis stood on the porch as the sun set, looking at the mountains that had become familiar. He'd allowed himself to imagine staying here, continuing Bernard's work. He'd imagined autumn visiting, maybe even helping. He'd imagined becoming the kind of person who did something that mattered. Foolish. He was 59 years old, divorced, with a daughter who was just starting to talk to him again. What had he been thinking? That he could just abandon his real life and play mountain man? That he could fill Bernard's shoes? He went inside, pulled out his laptop, and began drafting an email to the real estate agent. Then he stopped, his fingers hovering over the keys. On the desk beside the computer was Bernard's final journal. Lewis opened it to the last entry, reading it again by lamplight. "I've been thinking about the empty squares." Constance left them deliberately, believing someone would continue the work. "I won't live to see who that someone is. My health is failing faster than I'd like, but I find comfort in the idea that the lodge will outlive me, that someone will come here, understand what we built, and carry it forward." Lewis closed the journal and opened the desk drawer, looking for something else, anything that might help. Instead, he found a folder labeled Conservation Trust. Inside were letters, proposals, meeting notes. Bernard had been negotiating with the Wyoming Mountain Heritage Trust for over a year before he died. The plan was to place the lodge under a conservation easement, protecting it from development while allowing it to continue operating as a refuge. The trust would provide funding for maintenance and operations. Bernard would retain ownership during his lifetime, with the understanding that after his death, the property would transfer to the trust. They'd continue his mission, providing space for people in crisis, free of charge, funded by donations and grants. It had nearly happened. The paperwork was 90% complete, but then Bernard had gotten too sick to finish, and the deal had stalled. Lewis found a business card clipped to the folder. Millicent Ashworth, Executive Director, Wyoming Mountain Heritage Trust. He stared at the card for a long time. Then he checked his watch. 7:30. Probably too late to call, but he dialed anyway. Millicent Ashworth. "Miss Ashworth, my name is Lewis Hensley. I'm Bernard Kirkland's nephew. I inherited his property." "Mr. Hensley." Her voice warmed immediately. "I heard about Bernard's passing. I'm so sorry. He was a remarkable man." "Thank you. I found your correspondence with him about the conservation easement." "Yes, we were heartbroken when Bernard became too ill to complete the process. The lodge is exactly the kind of property our trust was created to protect." Lewis took a breath. Would the trust still be interested? Silence then. Potentially. But there would be complications. Bernard was the owner when we negotiated. You're the new owner, which means we'd need to start the approval process over. And I don't mean to be indelicate, but there's the matter of the tax debt. You know about that. It's public record. The trust would need the property to have clear title before we could accept it. We can't take on debt. Lewis felt his hope deflating. So it's not possible. "I didn't say that. If you could clear the debt, we could expedite the approval process. Our board meets monthly. I could present your case at the next meeting, which is in 3 weeks. If they approve, we could have the easement in place within 90 days, but I'd need to pay $48,000 first." "Yes, I'm sorry. I wish I could help with that, but our funding is restricted to properties already in trust." They talked for a few more minutes, Millicent explaining the process, what would be required, how the trust operated. Lewis thanked her and hung up, feeling worse than before. The path forward existed, but the obstacle was insurmountable. He sat in the dark for a long time, the fire burning down to coals. He could sell, walk away, put this whole foolish dream behind him and return to his real life. except his real life felt less real than this place did now. At midnight, he opened his laptop again and began researching. Loans, grants, crowdfunding, ways to raise $48,000 in 3 weeks. Every option seemed impossible or unlikely. Finally, exhausted, he climbed the stairs to Bernard's room, his room now, he supposed. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows from the dying fire move across the wood beams. A thought came to him then, something Bernard had written. The lodge isn't the building. It's the people who believe in what it can do. Louis sat up. The people. Fritz had offered to help. What if Louis reached out to all of them, everyone who'd stayed here, everyone who'd been helped? What if he told them what was happening, what was at stake? It was a long shot. Most of them were probably retired, living on fixed incomes, but maybe together, pooling what they could, it might be enough. He grabbed his phone and texted Autumn. Still awake? A minute later, yeah. What's wrong? Everything. I need your help. His phone rang immediately. Louis explained about the taxes, the deadline, the conservation trust, his crazy idea to reach out to Bernard's former residence. Autumn listened, without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Do you have their contact information?" "Most of them." Bernard kept an address book. "Okay, so here's what we do. You start calling people tonight. It's only 10 o'clock in Montana and earlier out west. Tell them what's happening, what you need. I'll set up a crowdfunding page. We'll document the story, share the history, explain why this place matters. We ask for help, but we also organize a gathering. Bring people to the lodge, let them see it again, remind them why it's worth saving. A gathering in 3 weeks? Autumn. The roads barely thawed. Then we do it in 2 weeks. We don't have time to wait. If people can't come in person, they can join virtually. But we need momentum, Dad. We need this to feel urgent and real and possible. Louis felt something shift in his chest. You'd help me do this? Of course. This is important. Uncle Bernard was doing something most people only talk about. He was actually helping people. That's worth fighting for. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Autumn would handle the online presence website, social media, crowdfunding platform. Louis would make calls, reach out personally to everyone in Bernard's address book. When they finally hung up, it was after 2 in the morning. Louis was exhausted but energized. It was still a long shot, but it was a shot. He looked at Bernard's address book, at all those names and numbers representing lives changed. Then he picked up his phone and started dialing. The first call went to Fritz. It was past midnight in Montana, but Fritz had said to call any time. Louis, what's happened? Louis explained everything, the taxes, the deadline, the plan to save the lodge through the conservation trust. His voice nearly broke describing the situation, but he pushed through. How much do you need? Fritz asked immediately. 48,000. I know it's impossible. I'm not asking anyone to. I can do 5,000. Business has been good. Bernard gave me a life. 5,000 is nothing compared to that. Louis had to sit down. Fritz, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm giving. Who else are you calling? By dawn, Louis had reached 7 people. Each one offered what they could, amounts ranging from $200 to Fritz's 5,000. By the time the sun rose over the mountains, he'd secured $12,000 in pledges. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Autumn called at 8. The crowdfunding page is live. I wrote the story based on what you told me, included photos of the journals you sent. It's already been shared 50 times. 50? How? I reached out to some contacts in Portland, people who care about this kind of thing. They're spreading it. Check your email, you've already got messages. Louis opened his laptop. His inbox was flooded. People asking questions, offering support, sharing their own stories of needing refuge. The crowdfunding page had raised $800 overnight from complete strangers. The next week was a blur. Lewis spent every waking hour on the phone or computer. He contacted everyone in Bernard's address book, explaining the situation. Some he couldn't reach, phone numbers disconnected, addresses outdated. But enough responded that the pledges kept growing. Constance called from Arizona, her voice thick with emotion. "Bernard gave me my life back. I'll send $1,000. It's all I can spare, but I wish it were more." Preston, who'd fixed the plumbing in 1992, offered $500 in his skills. "If you save the place, I'll come up for a month and update all the systems. Pro bono." Vera and Sterling, the couple who'd grieved their stillborn child at the lodge, sent $2,000 with a note. "This place held us when we couldn't hold ourselves. Let us help hold it now." The crowdfunding page kept climbing. 5,000, 10,000, 15. Autumn's social media posts were being shared across Wyoming and beyond. Local news picked up the story. A reporter from Jackson came to interview Lewis. "Why does this place matter?" the reporter asked, camera rolling. Lewis stood on the lodge porch, looking at the mountains. "Because sometimes people need a place to land. No judgment, no requirements, just space to figure things out. Bernard created that. In a world where everything has strings attached, this place had none. It just held people until they were ready to stand again." The interview aired that night. Donations doubled, but they were still short. With 1 week left before the deadline, they'd raised $32,000. Autumn had postponed her visit to focus on the campaign. Lewis barely slept, constantly refreshing the crowdfunding page, making calls, sending emails. George from the hardware store stopped by with a check for $500. "From me and the wife. Bernard helped us once. Now it's our turn." Harriet from the diner organized a fundraiser. The town raised $3,000 in one night. Lewis stood in the lodge each evening, watching the numbers climb, feeling the pressure of time running out. $16,000 short, with 5 days left. Then 4 days. Then 3. Millicent from the Conservation Trust called. "The board meets tomorrow. If you can show them you've cleared the debt or have a firm plan to do so, I'm confident they'll approve the easement. But I need something concrete." "We're close," Lewis said. 38,000 raised. People are still donating. "How much more time do you need?" "I don't know. The donations are slowing down. We might not make it." Silence on the line. Then Millicent said, "The trust can't help financially, but I'll present your case regardless. Sometimes boards surprise you." That night, Lewis couldn't sleep. He walked through the lodge, touching things, the furniture Bernard had refinished, the bookshelves he'd built, the fireplace where so many people had sat finding warmth. The place felt alive with memory, with purpose. He couldn't let it die. At 2 in the morning, his phone rang. "Fritz, I've been thinking," Fritz said. "I called some of the other folks who stayed at the lodge. The ones you haven't reached yet, found them through mutual connections. Between us, we've got another 4,000 coming." Lewis felt tears start. "Fritz, it's still not enough, I know, but we're trying. Everyone's trying." At dawn, Lewis made coffee and sat at Bernard's desk, looking at the address book one more time. He'd called everyone he could find. The crowdfunding page had plateaued. They were $42,000 into a $48,000 goal, with 2 days remaining. His phone buzzed, a text from Autumn. "Can you do a video call? I have an idea." They connected. Autumn looked tired but determined. "I want to do a live video stream from the lodge, tomorrow night. Show people the place, read from the journals, explain what's at stake. Sometimes people need to see something to believe. It's real. I don't know how to do that. I'll walk you through it." We set up a camera. You talk. Be yourself. Tell Bernard's story. Tell your story. Ask for help. Lewis hesitated. Speaking on camera, putting himself out there like that, it terrified him. But what choice did he have? "Okay, let's do it." They spent the next day preparing. Autumn sent equipment. Lewis set up the camera in the main room, positioning it to show the fireplace, the bookshelves, the windows overlooking the mountains. He gathered items, journals, photographs, the quilt, Albert's drawings, Fritz's chess set. That evening, 500 people joined the stream, then 1,000, then 2,000. Lewis sat in Bernard's chair and spoke from the heart. He told Bernard's story, the young veteran finding peace in the mountains. He told the stories of the people who'd found refuge here. He showed the journals, read passages aloud. He explained about the Conservation Trust, about the tax debt, about the deadline now, just over 24 hours away. "I didn't know my uncle well," Lewis said to the camera, "but I know what he built here mattered. It mattered to Fritz, who arrived broken and left whole. To Constance, who found safety when she had nowhere else to turn. To Albert, who discovered purpose after losing everything. To dozens of others, whose names I'm still learning. Bernard didn't do this for recognition. He did it because it was right. Because people need places like this. I'm asking you to help me keep this place alive so it can keep helping people." The donations started immediately. $50, $100, $20, $500. The page refreshed continuously, the total climbing. By the time Lewis ended the stream 2 hours later, they'd raised another $4,000. 46,000 total, 2,000 short. Lewis sat in the dark after everyone logged off, exhausted. So close. They'd come so close. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Diane. I stayed at the lodge in 1989. Bernard taught me to love birds again after my son died. I'm sending $2,000. It's my son's life insurance money. I've been holding on to it, not knowing what to do with it that would honor him. This feels right. Save the lodge." Lewis read the message 3 times, his hands shaking. They'd done it. $48,000. With 12 hours to spare. He called Autumn. She screamed when he told her. Then she cried. Then she laughed. "Dad, you did it. We did it." Lewis said, "Bernard's people, they saved his legacy." He sat alone in the lodge for a long time after that, feeling the weight of what had happened. Strangers and friends, people Bernard had helped decades ago, and people who'd never met him, had come together to save this place. The lodge wasn't just a building. Bernard had been right about that. It was an idea that people matter, that refuge matters, that creating space for healing is work worth doing. And now it would continue. Lewis looked at the empty squares on Constance's quilt, thinking about who might fill them in the years ahead, who might come here broken and leave whole, whose lives might change because people had believed this place was worth saving. Outside, the first hints of dawn touched the mountains. Inside, Lewis finally slept. The gathering was set for Saturday, 2 days after Lewis wired the tax payment to the county. Millicent had scheduled the trust board meeting for the following Monday, and she'd suggested bringing the community together beforehand, showing the board that public support was real, not just financial. Lewis woke that morning with nerves twisting his stomach. He'd spent the week cleaning, preparing, making the lodge presentable. Fritz had arrived 3 days early to help, driving down from Montana with a truck full of furniture he'd made gifts for the lodge. He said, pieces that belonged here. They'd worked side by side, Fritz talking constantly, sharing stories Lewis hadn't found in the journals. How Bernard had taught him to see wood grain as a map, how to let the material guide the work. How Bernard had never made him feel broken, only becoming. "You nervous about today?" Fritz asked over breakfast. "Terrified. What if nobody comes?" Fritz smiled. "They'll come. You'll see." By 10 o'clock, cars started arriving. Preston from Oregon, older now but still moving with purpose. Constance from Arizona, smaller than Lewis had imagined, her eyes bright with tears when she saw the lodge. Vera and Sterling from Colorado, holding hands like newlyweds despite their grey hair. George and Harriet came from town with supplies, food enough to feed an army. Other townspeople followed, people Lewis had met during his trips to Ridgewood, people who remembered Bernard's quiet generosity. The lodge filled with voices, with laughter, with embraces between people who'd last seen each other decades ago. Lewis stood near the fireplace, watching it all, feeling overwhelmed. Millicent arrived with 2 board members, taking notes, observing. Lewis had set up displays throughout the main room, journals open to significant entries, photographs arranged chronologically, artifacts labeled with their stories. Albert's botanical drawings hung on the walls. Fritz's chess set sat on the coffee table. Constance's quilt was draped over the couch, the empty squares visible. People gathered around each display, sharing reactions, pointing out details. Preston found the entry about him fixing the plumbing, laughed at Bernard's description. Preston worked 18 hours straight to fix what I'd been ignoring for months. Didn't complain once, just said it needed doing. Constance stood before the quilt for a long time, touching squares she'd sewn decades ago. "I never thought I'd see this again," she said quietly. Harriet moved through the room with trays of food. George helped Fritz start a fire in the fireplace, the 2 of them talking about Bernard's habit of building fires, even in summer, just for the comfort. By noon, nearly 40 people had arrived. The lodge felt alive in a way Lewis had never experienced, full of the energy Bernard must have known, people healing together, supporting each other, creating family from strangers. Millicent pulled Lewis aside. "This is remarkable. The board members are impressed. I think we'll have good news Monday." Lewis felt relief flood through him. "Thank you for believing this was possible. Bernard believed it first. You just carried it forward." People began sharing stories without prompting. Preston told about arriving at the lodge suicidal, how Bernard had given him work to do without asking why his hands shook. "He saved my life by making me feel useful," Preston said. "That's all it took." Vera shared how she and Sterling had come here after losing their daughter, how Bernard had let them grieve without trying to fix them. He understood that. Healing isn't about moving on quickly. It's about having space to feel everything until you're ready to feel something else. Constance spoke about arriving terrified, certain she'd never be safe again. Bernard asked one question, "What do you need?" Not, "What happened to you?" Not, "What are your plans?" Just, "What do you need?" And when I said time, he gave it to me. Fritz stood near the workshop display, his furniture samples drawing admiration. Bernard told me something I'll never forget. He said, "Your past is what happened to you. Your future is what you make. They're not the same thing." That's what this place taught me. I could make something different. Lewis listened to each story, understanding more fully what Bernard had created. It wasn't just shelter. It was permission to be broken, to take time, to heal at your own pace, without pressure or judgment. Autumn arrived late afternoon, having driven through the night from Portland. Lewis saw her car pull up, watched her climb out and stand for a moment, taking in the lodge, the mountains, the gathering visible through the windows. He met her at the door. "Dad." She hugged him hard. "This place is beautiful. Come, meet everyone." He introduced her around to Fritz, who'd brought her father back to life. To Constance, who'd shown what courage looked like, to all the people whose lives had intersected here and been changed by it. Autumn moved through the room with genuine interest, asking questions, listening to stories. Lewis watched her examine the displays, saw her pause at the quilt, touching the empty squares the way Constance had. She found him by the fireplace an hour later. "I understand now why you stayed, why this matters. I'm glad you came." "Me too." She looked around the crowded room. Uncle Bernard built something most people only dream about. A place where people actually help each other. No agenda, no strings, just kindness. Lewis felt his throat tighten. "I want to keep it going. Be the caretaker, run it as a retreat center. The trust will cover expenses, but I'd need to actually do the work. I'd be living here full time." Autumn smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Because I've been thinking I could help. Not live here, but visit regularly. Help with online presence, fundraising, connecting people who need refuge with this place. Marketing skills actually being useful for something that matters. Before Lewis could respond, Fritz called for attention. The room quieted. "I want to propose a toast," Fritz said, raising his glass. "To Bernard, who showed us that helping people doesn't require perfection, just presence. And to Lewis, who's choosing to continue what Bernard started. That takes courage." Everyone raised their glasses. "To Bernard," to Lewis. Lewis looked around the room at faces young and old, at people who'd been strangers weeks ago, at his daughter standing beside him, at the lodge holding them all. Millicent caught his eye from across the room and nodded. This was it. The proof Bernard's work could continue, that the lodge wasn't just history, it was future. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Inside, the gathering continued, voices filling the space with warmth and purpose. Lewis thought about the empty squares on the quilt, about the people who'd come here next, about the stories still waiting to be told. The lodge was ready, and so was he. As evening settled in, the gathering shifted from formal storytelling to something more intimate. Small groups formed throughout the lodge, conversations weaving between past and present. Lewis found himself moving between them, listening more than talking, absorbing what this place had meant to so many people. In the kitchen, Constance and Harriet were preparing dinner together, their movements coordinated like they'd worked side by side for years instead of having just met. Preston was showing the board members the plumbing system he'd installed decades ago, still functioning perfectly. Fritz pulled Lewis aside near the workshop display. "I have something for you." He handed Lewis a small cloth bundle. Inside was a wooden box, beautifully crafted with dovetail joints and a hinged lid. The wood grains swirled like water. "Made it last month," Fritz said. "Didn't know why at the time. Now I do. Open it." Inside the box was money-crisp bills in neat stacks. "Fritz, what? $6,000. From the folks who stayed here over the years. We pooled it together. Consider it a start for the operational fund. The tax debt is cleared, but you'll need money for repairs, supplies, whatever comes up." Lewis stared at the money, overwhelmed. "I can't accept this." "You already did, the moment you decided to save this place." Fritz's eyes were serious. "We're invested now, all of us. This isn't just your burden anymore." Before Lewis could respond, Autumn appeared at his side. She'd been talking with Millicent and the board members, her phone in hand. "Dad, I need to show you something." She pulled up her phone, showing him the crowdfunding page. "Remember that woman who donated at the last minute? Diane? The one whose son died. She sent the final $2,000. She shared her story on social media. It went viral. Look." The crowdfunding page had exploded. New donations were pouring in. $50, $100, $2,500. The total had climbed to $62,000. "There's $14,000 more than you needed," Autumn said. "People are still giving. They want to support ongoing operations, not just the tax debt." Lewis couldn't speak. He looked from the phone to Fritz's wooden box, to the room full of people who'd come to support a place that had once supported them. Constance appeared, carrying a small bag. "Lewis, I have something too." She pulled out a crayon drawing, faded and creased from decades of storage. Autumn made this when she visited here as a child. She was maybe 7. She drew this picture of the lodge and gave it to Bernard. He kept it all these years. Autumn took the drawing with trembling hands. "I remember this. I'd forgotten we came here once, didn't we? Mom and I drove up for a day." "You spent hours by the lake," Constance said. "You told Bernard you wanted to live in the mountains when you grew up. He said the lodge would always be here if you needed it." Autumn's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't remember. After the divorce, everything from that time felt, I don't know, tainted somehow. But this place wasn't. This was good." She turned to Lewis. "I'm sorry I dismissed this at first. I thought you were running away, but you were running toward something, toward this." Louis hugged his daughter, feeling the walls that had built between them finally crumbling. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to start rebuilding. Millicent approached with her 2 board members. "Mr. Hensley, we'd like to speak with you." Louis's heart hammered as they moved to a quieter corner. The 3 trust members looked serious. "We've seen enough," Millicent said. "The board will meet Monday as scheduled, but I'm confident in saying we'll approve the conservation easement. This gathering proves community investment. The fundraising proves sustainability. Your commitment proves continuity." One of the board members, an older woman with kind eyes, spoke up. "My question is about your vision." Bernard ran this place informally, by word of mouth. "How do you see it operating going forward?" Louis had been thinking about this for days. "The same way, mostly. I don't want to formalize it too much, add applications or screening or bureaucracy. People in crisis need refuge, not paperwork. But I'd like to be more intentional about connecting with counselors, veterans organizations, domestic violence services. Not as requirements, but as resources people can access if they want." "And your role?" the other board member asked. "Caretaker, host. I keep the door open, the fire burning, the place safe. I give people time and space, just like Bernard did." Millicent smiled. "That's exactly what we hoped you'd say. The trust will provide a modest salary, along with covering property expenses. You won't get rich, but you'll be able to sustain yourself and the lodge." Relief and joy flooded through Louis. "Thank you, all of you." As the board members returned to the gathering, Fritz appeared with his chess set. "Remember this? Let's finish the game," Bernard started. They sat by the fireplace, the party continuing around them. Louis studied the board, the pieces positioned mid-game, waiting decades for their next move. "I don't know whose move it was," Louis said. "Doesn't matter, start fresh. That's what this place is about anyway." They reset the board and began to play. Around them, the lodge hummed with life conversations, laughter, the clink of dishes, the warmth of community. Autumn sat with Constance and Harriet, looking at old photographs. Preston was teaching the board members about the wood stove. The room felt complete, purposeful. As the evening deepened, people began leaving, each one thanking Louis, promising to stay in touch, offering help whenever needed. Constance hugged him at the door. "Bernard would be proud," she said. "You found your way here just like the rest of us did, lost and looking for something. Turns out what we were all looking for was a place to matter." She pressed something into his hand, a spool of thread and a needle. "For the quilt, when you're ready to add your square." After everyone left, just Louis, Autumn, and Fritz remained. They sat by the dying fire, exhausted and content. "I'm staying through Monday," Autumn said. "Help you celebrate when the trust makes it official." "I'd like that." Fritz stood, stretching. "I should get some sleep. Long drive back to Montana tomorrow. But Louis, you call me when the first person arrives who needs help. I want to know the lodge is working again." After Fritz went upstairs, Louis and Autumn sat in comfortable silence. "You found your purpose, didn't you?" she finally said. Louis looked around the lodge, at the life Bernard had built, at the future that was now possible. "I think I did." Spring came to the mountains in late April, 3 months after Louis had first driven through the snow to see what he'd inherited. The board had approved the conservation easement unanimously. The paperwork was signed. The lodge officially belonged to the Wyoming Mountain Heritage Trust, with Louis as its permanent caretaker and director. The winter damage was extensive: broken gutters, a leaking roof section, water damage in one of the upstairs bedrooms. But Louis had time now, and help. Preston had come back for 2 weeks to update the plumbing throughout. Fritz sent furniture to replace pieces too worn to repair. The operational fund from the crowdfunding campaign covered materials. Louis worked steadily through March and into April, repairing and restoring. His hands grew calloused again, his back stronger. He learned the lodge's rhythms, where the sun hit in morning, how wind moved through the pines, when the lake ice would crack and finally thaw. He'd called his old boss in early March, officially resigned. The conversation was brief. They'd already filled his position. Nobody seemed surprised he wasn't coming back. The house in the suburbs sold in 6 weeks. Sandra signed the final papers without comment. The proceeds gave Louis a financial cushion, though he no longer worried about money the way he once had. His needs were simple now: food, firewood, basic supplies. The trust salary covered those, and a little more. Autumn visited twice more before the snow fully melted. She'd taken a contract position that let her work remotely, spending a week each month at the lodge. She'd set up a website, created social media accounts, built networks with counselors and social workers who might refer people in need of refuge. The first guest arrived on a Tuesday in May. Her name was Bryn. She was 53, recently fired from a teaching job after a breakdown in her classroom. She'd heard about the lodge from a counselor in Jackson and had called the number on the website, her voice shaking. Louis told her what Bernard used to say: "Come when you're ready, stay as long as you need." She arrived with one suitcase and eyes that looked at everything like she expected it to disappear. Louis showed her to the smallest bedroom upstairs, Constance's old room. He didn't hover. He made dinner, set a place for her, let her come down when she was ready. That first evening, they ate in silence. Then Bryn said quietly, "Thank you for not asking questions." Bernard taught me that. People tell their stories when they're ready. Over the next week, Louis learned to hold space the way Bernard had. He gave Bryn work when she seemed to need it, helping in the garden. He'd restored from Albert's old plans, organizing the library, repainting the kitchen. He gave her silence when she needed that instead. He kept the fire burning and the coffee hot, and the door unlocked. By the second week, she was talking more. About the pressure that had built over years of teaching, about feeling like she was failing everyone, about the panic attack that had come in front of 30 teenagers, leaving her unable to breathe, unable to function. "I don't know if I can go back," she said one evening on the porch. "You don't have to decide that now. You just have to be here now." Bryn stayed 6 weeks. Gradually, Louis watched the tension leave her shoulders. Her laugh came more easily. She started taking long hikes, coming back with observations about birds and wildflowers, her teacher's curiosity rekindling. The day she left, she hugged him at the door. "I'm not fixed, but I remember who I am again. That's enough to start with." After she drove away, Louis sat on the porch for a long time. He'd done it, provided refuge the way Bernard had, without pressure or judgment, just space and time. He pulled out the journal he'd started keeping. Bernard's tradition continued in a fresh, leather-bound book. He wrote about Bryn's stay, what she'd taught him about patience, about how healing looked different for everyone. That afternoon, he brought out Constance's quilt. He'd been avoiding this, uncertain he'd earned the right, but now, holding the needle and thread Constance had given him, he felt ready. He found an old shirt in his closet, one he'd worn to work for years, conservative blue, boring pattern. The shirt of his old life. He cut a square from it carefully, pinned it to the quilt where Constance had left space, and began to sew. His stitches were uneven, amateurish compared to hers, but they held. As he worked, he thought about transformation, how he'd arrived here, broken, and found purpose, how the lodge had saved him just as it had saved everyone else who'd needed it. When he finished, he held up the quilt. His square sat among all the others: Bernard, Fritz, Albert, Constance, and dozens more whose stories were woven into fabric. The next square remained empty, waiting for whoever came next. Autumn arrived that weekend for her monthly visit. Louis showed her the completed square, and she traced it with her finger. "It belongs here," she said. "You belong here." They spent the weekend working together, Autumn handling online inquiries while Louis planted more of the garden. 2 more people had reached out, asking about staying. A veteran struggling with PTSD, a woman leaving a 40-year marriage. Lewis scheduled them for June, making sure their stays wouldn't overlap unless they wanted company. Sunday evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The lake had fully thawed, reflecting the sky like dark glass. "Are you happy, Dad?" Autumn asked. Lewis considered the question. Happy seemed too simple for what he felt: purpose, peace, connection, responsibility. But underneath all of it, yes, something like happiness. "I am." "Are you?" "Getting there. Being here helps. Seeing you like this alive again, that helps too." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged. Inside, the lodge waited for its next resident, its next story. The fire Lewis had built earlier still burned in the fireplace. The journals sat on their shelf, documenting decades of lives changed. The quilt lay folded, ready to grow. Lewis thought about Bernard's words. The lodge isn't the building, it's the people who believe in what it can do. He believed now, fully, and that belief felt like the most important inheritance of all. Not property or possessions, but faith that broken people could heal, that strangers could become family, that creating refuge was work worth doing. The mountains stood eternal around them. The lodge held its space among them, and Lewis, once lost, had finally found where he was meant to be. He was home.